Tracy Sable tonight on EWTN News Nightly. Same-sex marriage. The Senate advances a bill opposed to Catholic teaching. We're on Capitol Hill. U.S. Bishops Conference. Analysis from a busy 4 days in Baltimore. Midterm elections. Updating conservative wins in local school board races. And religious masterpieces. A collection of frescoes returns to Rome. These stories and more tonight.
From EWTN, the Global Catholic Network, this is EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you for being with us on the Feast of St. Elizabeth of Hungary, our top story tonight. Now the Republicans have secured majority of the House come January. Part of the GOP's commitment to America calls for investigations. And today, House Republicans announced that they are opening a probe to determine the extent of President Biden's involvement in his son Hunter's business dealings. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales reports. Eric?
Well, good evening, Tracy. Republicans on the House Oversight and Reform Committee, led by Congressman James Comer, say that they've already gathered incriminating evidence such as wire fraud, money laundering, and even tax evasion, not by Hunter Biden himself, but also by his father, Joe Biden, when he served as Vice President of the United States.
We also found plans based in the United States where the Biden family swindled investors of hundreds of thousands of dollars, all with Joe Biden's participation and knowledge.
Citing Justice Department whistleblowers, Congressman James Comer alleges that President Joe Biden may be compromised due to his involvement in overseas business dealings alongside his son Hunter.
As part of our investigation, we have evidence that the finances, credit cards, and bank accounts of Hunter and Joe Biden were commingled, if not shared. And on some accounts, at least, red flags were raised by banks to the account owner or owners indicating suspicious or illegal activity.
Republicans say that they're concentrating on Joe Biden himself, but say they're running into opposition from the Treasury and Justice Department for Biden's family business records.
We've had over 14 whistleblowers come talk to us. Every single one has said at the highest levels of the Justice Department here in D.C., the Washington field office and the Justice Department here in D.C., that is where the politics are involved. That is where the political decisions are being made. We have a concern with that. That's what we're focused on.
Republicans vow Americans need to know the truth. Meanwhile, a major announcement by self-professed Catholic House Speaker Nancy Pelosi.
I will not seek re-election to Democratic leadership in the next Congress. For me, the hours come for a new generation to lead the Democratic caucus that I so deeply respect.
Also tonight, we want to give you an update on the Same-Sex Marriage Act. It's one step closer to becoming law. Yesterday, a dozen Republican senators actually joined 50 Democrats, and they advanced it. Now, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has issued a statement about it, and they are defending marriage as, quote, a lifelong exclusive union between one man and one woman, and they are urging lawmakers to vote against it. The final vote is expected sometime after Thanksgiving. At the Capitol, Eric Rosales, EWTN News Nightly.
Well, the U.S. bishops closed out their meeting in Baltimore today after a whirlwind week. In the wake of 4 days of deliberations, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops now has a new president, Archbishop Timothy Broglio of the Military Services. Also of note, the calls for canonization for 3 American women will now proceed. Joining us tonight with a wrap-up of the bishop's busy week is Dr. Matthew Bunson, Executive Editor of EWTN News. Dr. Bunson, always good to be with you. A lot to unpack, but first, let's start off with the bishop's discussion on faithful citizenship. What can you tell us about this matter, and where do you see the bishops taking it in the future?
Here we are just a few weeks removed from the midterm elections of 2022, and the bishops are very focused on the next election in 2024 and what to do with their document called Faithful Citizenship, Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship. And what they decided to do with these guidelines for Catholic voters and how they should discern in voting was to reissue essentially the document that's been present since 2007. It's been updated once or twice, including in 2019. But to supplement it with a variety of other multimedia guides and inserts, essentially to try to update it to where we are today as a country, which was one of the requests made by a number of bishops, who also argue that when this original document came out in 2007, it really no longer reflects or does not reflect much of the teachings of Pope Francis. Against that argument, however, a number of bishops, including several who really defended the document, wanted to make the point that Catholic social teaching doesn't really change and that this document is still very, very reliable. And in that sense, then, I think that the bishops found a kind of compromise going forward where they're going to reissue this document for 24, but then look at a pretty significant revision of it over the coming years.
Yeah, and as we mentioned earlier, 3 American women are now on the path to sainthood. Among them, Cora Evans, who really truly lived a remarkable life. For those who are not familiar, can you talk to us about her?
Yes, we have 3 saints who've been sort of promoted by the Conference of Bishops. That's an important step in these the processes of canonization or beatification. In this case, Cora Evans, who died, I think, in 1957, was a housewife. She was a convert from the Mormon Church who had this mystical encounter with our Lord as a young girl, and it brought her eventually into the church. As a convert, she was also a mystic and somebody who seemed to live a very ordinary life, but who had a truly extraordinary spiritual life. She was somebody who I think who stands as a kind of role model for Catholics today, for all people today, in much the same way that Michelle Dupont, one of the others prospective saints who was advanced and promoted by the U.S. bishops just this last week, a young woman who died in 2015 at the age of 31 from cancer. She had been a campus ministry with Focus, the Fellowship of Catholic University Students. Again, seemed to live a very ordinary life and yet lived an extraordinary spiritual life. Both Evans and Dupont, I think, are notable because they're contemporaries of ours. One died in 1957, the other in 2015. A recognition of the fact that holiness, its sanctity, is timeless, but it is also very much modern. And that's a reminder, I think, that we all need, that the saints are all around us, even exactly as we are all called to be saints ourselves.
Indeed. And before I let you go, I'm curious, Matthew, what were your major takeaways from this week's gathering, especially when it comes to the area of elections?
Yeah, the election of Archbishop Timothy Broglio represents, I think, a statement from the USCCB, not as some in the progressive Catholic media had argued, some sort of rejection of Pope Francis. Rather, the conference itself is looking for somebody who spent many years as a trained diplomat, somebody who can really build bridges in what is a very divided and polarized time in the United States and even in the Church. Archbishop Broglio, I think, speaks to being diplomatic, but he also pledged to carry forward so much of the work done by the remarkable and outgoing President Archbishop Jose Gomez of Los Angeles, pledging himself as the new president to really bring forward that unity among the bishops that we need to have, but also to build in culture a sense of unity built again on Catholic social principles, Catholic social teaching.
Well, Dr. Bunson, thank you again. Always, always a pleasure to have you and get your insights. We appreciate it.
Good to be with you.
President Joe Biden is back at the White House following his overseas trip late last night. He made headlines when asked about an overseas explosion. White House correspondent Owen Judson reports. Owen?
Hi, Tracy. Good evening to you. This stems, of course, from the war in Ukraine. Just today, Russian airstrikes killed at least 4 people across that country. And just after midnight, here at the White House, President Joe Biden was asked this question by a reporter. Take a listen.
What's your reaction to President Zelenskyy saying that the missiles that landed in Poland were not Ukrainian?
That's not the evidence.
Today, Poland's president visited the site, a farming community close to Ukraine's border, where a missile killed 2 men. Early indications blame a Ukrainian air defense system meant to counter the Russian bombardment. Meanwhile, a new deal reached to help feed the world, the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke from Thailand.
Together, we sent a clear message to President Putin that he should extend the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which was set to expire on Saturday. This is a vital lifeline for the rest of the world, delivering more than 10 million metric tons of much-needed food, the overwhelming majority of which is going to the developing world.
But the war rages on. Ukrainian President Zelenskyy published a video showing a large ball of fire and smoke. The strike in the Ukrainian city of Dnipro injured at least 14 people. And back in the U.S., President Joe Biden announced his support for a controversial bill moving through the Senate that would further legalize same-sex weddings. He writes, Republicans and Democrats can work together to secure the fundamental right of Americans to marry the person they love. The self-professed Catholic president issued another statement claiming midterm voters wanted to protect the right to choose. While former Vice President Mike Pence, a possible contender for the Oval Office in 2024, told a town hall that he always believed Roe v. Wade would be overturned. He just didn't know if it would happen in his lifetime.
It may take as long to restore the sanctity of life to the center of American law in all 50 states as it did to overturn Roe versus Wade.
Now, regarding the news on House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, as Eric reported earlier, in a statement, President Biden called Pelosi the most consequential Speaker of the House in our history. And because of her, quote, the lives of millions and millions of Americans are better, end quote. At the White House, Owen Jensen, EWTN News Nightly.
We have a lot more still to come here on EWTN News Nightly, including classroom accountability, analysis of how conservative candidates won local school board races across the country, and 2 Middle East nations agree on conservation for the Jordan River. Thanks for staying with us. A bright spot in the wake of what many consider a disheartening midterm. Conservative school board candidates emerged victorious in a number of elections across the country last week, including left-leaning states like Maryland and New Jersey. And in Florida, 25 of 30 school board candidates backed by Governor Ron DeSantis toasted victory. And joining us now to discuss is Jeremiah Poff, education reporter for the Washington Examiner. Jeremiah, welcome back. Good to see you again. It seems like most of these races really came down to the question of parental rights in schools. What more can you tell us about this?
Yeah, so parental rights has been a huge issue in the last couple of years, both on the national political scale, but also it's permeated down to the local level. The biggest watershed moment, I think, for this was when Governor DeSantis decided to endorse 30 different school board candidates in Florida, and of those 30, 25 of them won. So obviously he went on to win an enormous victory a couple weeks ago, and it seems like that kind of carried down ballot to these pro-parental rights candidates. But it wasn't just limited to Florida. In South Carolina, a group called Moms for Liberty endorsed a number of candidates, and they flipped the school board in the city of Charleston. In Maryland, a school board flipped to a conservative control as well. It's kind of taken the country by storm in local areas where people don't really think about the national headlines.
Yeah, and you know what? I want to go back to, you mentioned Governor Ron DeSantis. He backed a bill banning instruction on sexual orientation and gender identity for younger students. He caught a lot of flack for it nationwide, as you know. However, that move really seemed a boon for those board members that he backed. Talk to us more about that.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like the so-called Don't Say Gay bill hurt Governor DeSantis. Obviously, that bill was actually called the Parental Rights and Education Act. And it looks like it proved pretty popular to the people of Florida. And going forward, there's going to be a lot more of DeSantis-aligned school board members throughout the state of Florida that are they're going to take steps to more aggressively, I think, implement his education agenda.
Yeah, and Jeremiah, what do you think the lesson is here, when you look at these school board outcomes overall?
Well, I think the message here is that local politics still really, really matters. A lot of people spend a lot of time focused on what's happening in Congress, and obviously, that was a major, issue. Of course, the Republicans took control of the House, but down ballot, local officials still affect people's lives, and I think there's been somewhat of an awakening in terms, especially among conservatives and Republicans, about how much these local races actually do matter, and that's why you've seen people like Governor DeSantis and groups like Moms for Liberty, and then a PAC called the 1776 Project PAC that threw a bunch of money into school board races around the country. All these groups have all of a sudden really invested into school board races, especially because there's been so much concern about what's been going on in our public schools, and the school boards are ultimately the arbiters of what happens in a public school.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, really quickly, we have about a minute left, but I really want to get to this and get your take on it. This week, Montgomery County in Maryland, the schools there unveiled a, quote, LGBTQ inclusive book list for students as young as 4. So, you know, basically we're talking preschoolers here. The books use words like intersex and drag queen. What more do you know about this, and also the reaction that it's been getting?
Well, it seemed. I mean, the MCPS is pretty defensive about it. They say that it's not mandatory, but you know, this kind of thing is unfortunately very common in a lot of school districts, and it's certainly not limited to Montgomery County. But you're seeing a lot of LGBTQ issue related books and content, you know, being pushed on young children, and this is just the latest example of that.
All right, we're going to leave it right there. Jeremiah, thank you so much for your analysis. Always appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Up next on EWTN News Nightly, Catholic art, the journey of 17th century frescoes from Spain back to Rome. Plus, the Vatican Department for Proclaiming the Gospel marks a milestone anniversary. We are back. The man who killed 6 people in a Christmas parade in Wisconsin last year has been sentenced to life in prison with no chance of release. The judge says that she was horrified by the footage of the incident.
You left a path of destruction, chaos, death, injury, confusion, and panic as you drove 7 or so blocks through the Christmas parade.
40-year-old Darrell Brooks cited a history of mental illness as a defense for last year's attack. He was found guilty of driving his car through the parade. Among those killed, an 8-year-old boy marching with his baseball team. Well, Israel and Jordan have signed an initial agreement to save the Jordan River. The two neighboring nations signed a declaration of intent today at the UN Climate Conference. They will partner to conserve the waters which mark their shared boundary. The Jordan River is one of the holiest sites in Christianity. Recently, it has suffered from overuse and pollution. Our British lawmakers pledged to help the vulnerable during a cost of living crisis.
Our priorities are stability, growth, and public services.
The government announced an emergency budget today totaling some $65 billion US. Taxes will increase for top income brackets. There will also be a windfall profits tax on energy companies and changes to health care spending. A collection of historic artwork has returned to a gallery in Rome after almost 200 years in Spain. The frescoes of the Herrera Chapel collection were painted in the early 1600s at the request of a Spanish banker in thanksgiving for a cure of his son. The artist, Annibale Carracci, was the artist. The works were sent to Spain in the 1830s to spare them from damage. They are now on exhibit in Rome's Barbary Palace through early February. And finally tonight, a Vatican department dedicated to the church's missionary activity is turning 400 years old. A 3-day conference this week examines the history of the Congregation of Propaganda Fide. It was founded in 1622 by Pope Gregory XV. Earlier this year, as part of the Holy Father's plan, it was combined with the new Office for Evangelization. We go now to Monsignor Camillus Johnpillai, head of the Office of the Dicastery for Evangelization. Monsignor, welcome. Great to have you with us. Can you tell us more about the history of Propaganda Fide and why it was started, and also the type of work it does?
The sacred congregation, the Propaganda Fide, means a congregation or a dicastery that is meant for the propagation of the faith. Now, This congregation was founded on the 6th of January in 1622, namely in the 17th century. In order to understand the purpose of the institution of this congregation, we have to understand also the historical background, the time, the history of the time. Namely, in the 17th century, the church was getting ready for a certain reform. After the Council of Trent in the 16th century, the church was more interested with regard to the inner renewal of the church, as well as also to expand the church. Because with the Reformation in the 16th century, some members of the church became Protestants, and therefore some people went away from the church. And also, even before that, we have heard about the famous schism, namely the separation of the churches in the Orient, namely the Orthodox Church. And also, there were people due to heresy, they were out of the church. At that time, the church was in need not only of an inner renewal of the church, but also to expand the church, namely to bring back all those who did not belong to the church. Therefore, when Pope Gregory XV in the year 1622 founded the Sacred Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, the purpose of that congregation was not only to propagate the faith, but also to bring back those who left the church for various reasons. And therefore, in the 17th century, the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith had a wider competence. Not only, for example, to bring back all those who went away from the church or who separated themselves from the church, but also to expand the church, namely to propagate, to proclaim the good news of salvation to those who do not know Christ.
Can you tell us a little bit about the work at the Dicastery? What sort of projects are you working on?
Yes. Now, after the latest reform by Pope Francis this year, our congregation is no more called as the Sacred Congregation or Congregation for Evangelization of Peoples, but it is simply known as the Dicastery for Evangelization, Section for First Evangelization and New Particular Churches. Namely, this particular dicastery, earlier known as Propaganda Fide, is charged with the looking after of the new particular churches, the dioceses throughout the world, especially in Africa, Asia, and some territories in America and Oceania. And altogether, we have a total of 1,117 dioceses or archdioceses and vicariates or prefectures throughout the world. And the pontifical mission societies, which come under our direction, help us actually to look after these dioceses both spiritually and materially.
Well, Monsignor, thank you for your time today. We really appreciate it. Monsignor Camillus Johnpillai, head of the Office of the Dicastery for Evangelization. Thank you again. God bless you. And we thank you for watching tonight. Remember, you can follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at EWTN News Nightly. I'm Tracy Sable. Good night and God bless.